How did Jews fit into the modern state? That, in essence, was the Jewish question. And it was a question that both Jews and non-Jews were asking really from the 18th century, but largely and with increasing interest in the 19th century. And as we've seen, it ultimately leads in the 20th century to Germany's, to Nazis' answer, which is the final solution, which is the eradication of Jewish people. But during the 19th century, not only were non-Jews asking this question of, in the modern liberal state, how do you now allow for Jewish people who had historically been excluded because they weren't part of the dominant society, and the question of how do you integrate minorities, particularly minorities of a different faith community. This was something that non-Jews were thinking about, but it was a question, as we've seen, that Jews were also thinking about. And Jews, particularly in places like England and in Western Europe, where they were largely integrating successfully, or at least increasingly so, they were thinking about the plights of Jews in other places where they were experiencing overt and really quite significant anti-Semitism and persecution, whether things like blood libels or other kinds of economic restrictions and so on, that made the lives of Jews in those places truly unbearable. And so we saw how Sir Moses Montefiore in the middle of the 19th century attempted through his personal advocacy to improve the plights of Jews across, many places of the world, whether in North Africa, in Russia, in Eastern Europe, into the Holy Land. But we saw how his ability to do that was limited to his efforts, and that ultimately, even towards the end of his life, his ability to succeed was declining. And so Jews then picked up the need for a different solution. And at first, figures like Baron Hirsch attempted to provide influx of resources, financial resources, into these places so Jews could gain a broader secular education, could hopefully therefore contribute more, could be seen as contributors to modern society, and as a result would win rights and protections in those places as well. But ultimately, that proved unsuccessful. Even with those efforts, it was clear in Eastern Europe and other places that Jews were continuing to suffer the most horrendous persecution and anti-Semitism. And so Baron Hirsch comes forward with this grand idea of relocating Jews out of Eastern Europe. And towards that end, he creates a settlement in Argentina where Jews can live. But ultimately, as we saw, despite those efforts, it didn't really succeed. Only a limited number of people were able to take advantage and made that move. And he represents this moment of Jewish philanthropists trying through their financial efforts to improve the lot of Jews. And in that group, you can think of the Sassoons, the Rothschilds, and of course, all three of them together were part of what became known as the Marlborough set, which was this group of people who socialized with Prince Albert Bertie in London. And so they had a tight social network and kind of had this joint philanthropic activity. But ultimately, it didn't work. And Jews continued to be persecuted in Eastern Europe. It was unclear where Jews could settle, even if they were settling in places like America or London's East End. It was with challenges, and it was haphazard, and it wasn't in an organized way. And really, there was a sense of this may not be a viable solution. What's incredible, and that's going to be the focus of today, is that somebody comes forward and posits a solution that is, and on one hand was radical, on one hand was obvious. And that, of course, is Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl writes a work in 1896 called The Jewish State. And in it, he lays out a vision for creating a Jewish homeland, a place of Jewish autonomy, right? Where he embraces the idea that Jews also have the right to self-determination. And indeed, that will be the only way that Jews will be able to flourish, will be able to create a society in which they can succeed, they can live their life to their fullest, and ultimately can create a state that will be able to be positive contributors to the world. And Theodor Herzl was not the person you would have expected this idea to come from. He, secular background, was born in Budapest, unclear whether he even ever had a bar mitzvah, ultimately settles in Paris where he's a journalist of some note, and he comes up with this idea of Jewish autonomy. And in a sense, he comes up with it because of his own experience. You know, here he is, a secular Jewish person. At one point, he even thinks around the idea of, similar to what Hirsch at one point had thought of, maybe Jews should simply be converting to answer the Jewish question. But ultimately, what he sees is that even in places like Paris, where Jews ostensibly are equal citizens, they still are meeting increased anti-Semitism. And of course, the Dreyfus affair will really drive that home. Here you have a captain in the French army who is accused falsely of treason, and it brings about this huge firestorm of anti-Semitism. It's underpinned by anti-Semitism, and it really is this kind of like moment of recognition that even in places where you think Jews are doing okay, ultimately there's only so far they can go. Ultimately, anti-Semitism will continue to rear its ugly head. And so Herzl, in a frenzy of activity, in June of 1896, writes The Jewish State. And in it, he lays out a vision, not just of the idea of a state, but in a sense, what will need to happen in order to create this state. It begins to be, shall we say, almost like a roadmap for implementation of Jewish autonomy. And it's incredible because someone like Herzl had come from this secular background. It was not necessarily expected that he would have been the one to come up with this solution, which of course in some ways, as I mentioned, is natural. Jews come from Jewish self-determination in the ancient Holy Land. We continue to pray for a return to the Holy Land. And so in a sense, it's natural. On the other hand, it was complete fancy. I mean, the Ottomans were controlling the Holy Land. It was clear they were not supportive of Jewish settlement there, though there had been some local settlements where Jews had purchased land and had created some settlements there under Rothschild and others. But ultimately, there was no sense that there was really support for this. And so what he says is that Jews need to create this as a reality. And this leads to the establishment of the first Zionist Congress in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. And it brings together people who support the idea of Jewish autonomy, Jewish settlement, perhaps at the very least, from Eastern Europe, from Western Europe, from different places, to come together to start thinking about the Jewish future, the answer to the Jewish question. And amazingly, it brings together people who really did not see eye to eye. You know, there were those who believed Jews should simply just purchase land, settle it. That's it, kind of localized settlements. Or perhaps that through these activities, it could cause the Ottomans to actually shut down whatever successes some Jews had found in these small settlements through the Chibat Zion movement. And of course, there were Jews in the West who also didn't support the Zionist activity, Jews in England and other places who felt that this would potentially undermine their own place in the places where they had lived, perhaps allegations of dual allegiance, dual loyalty, and people who felt that it ultimately was a dream. It wasn't something worthy of investing in. Of course, Rothschild had been investing in Jewish settlement in the Holy Land, but again, as a localized place for Jews to live, not this kind of grander vision of it. Interestingly, when Herzl went to press his case in London, one of the arguments he made was that people weren't also thrilled with the fact that Eastern European Jews were settling on in London's East End. And he said, if you create a Jewish state, a place of Jewish autonomy, well, then those people can live there instead. And so he ended up needing to walk a fine line between this notion of somehow being against the freedom of Jewish movement, or kind of that he would join those who are anti-immigration, anti-Jewish immigration, but at the same time, shall we say, recognizing that creating Jewish slums wasn't really in anybody's interest, and therefore perhaps creating a Jewish state would provide an answer to a whole variety of questions and challenges in his time. And so ultimately through this, he was able to bring together a wide variety of people with different perspectives and different agendas to ultimately invest together in this enterprise of a Jewish Congress that would ultimately lay the foundation for the creation of a Jewish state. It brought together people who were religious Zionists, who were uncomfortable with a secular Jew kind of wearing the crown, as it were, as the president of this movement. But ultimately, Herzl did something that no one had done before, which was to bring people together and to say this can't be something we do haphazardly or individually or in a disorganized way. It needs to be something which is a national, international Jewish movement that brings everybody together, lays out a roadmap to ultimately lead to Jewish autonomy. And they create a bank, and they create some of the, shall we say, core infrastructures that will be necessary for the functioning of a Jewish state. Now, what's interesting is Herzl is not necessarily advocating for an independent Jewish state in the way we think of the state of Israel today. He was actually thinking more along the lines of an autonomous area. In fact, he wasn't the first person to do that. Mordechai Emanuel Noah had thought to do it in upstate New York, outside of Buffalo, in Ararat, earlier in the 19th century. And Herzl himself, while recognizing that the land that had become known as Palestine, right, since the Romans renamed it after the conquest of ancient Israel, that was the natural place, but he also recognized that didn't necessarily have to be there, and certainly it could take time for it to be there, and perhaps there could be other places as well where Jews could find that they could have autonomy. And indeed, even if it was in the Holy Land, it was ruled by the Ottomans, and so perhaps at the very least they could get the Ottomans to permit them to have an autonomous area in the Holy Land, but not necessarily an fully independent state. The Ottomans ultimately were cool to the idea, and eventually he kind of shifts his focus to Britain. And so the Fourth Zionist Congress is in London, and it ultimately leads to meetings with Chamberlain and the question of, well, maybe it could be in Sinai. Wouldn't that be, shall we say, a good jumping off point to eventually lead to the land of Israel? And eventually to the proposal that it maybe just be in Africa, in Uganda. And Herzl, at this point, seeing the plight of Jews from the Kishinev pogroms and so on, thought maybe that was a good idea. It was brought to the Congress, and ultimately, after debate, the answer was no. It has to be in the ancient Jewish homeland. That is only natural place for Jewish self-determination. Incredibly, Herzl's endeavor doesn't succeed in his own lifetime. He dies, shortly thereafter. But amazingly, despite the fact that Herzl really, shall we say, saw himself as central to this vision, it was really became his life passion. He was the president of the Congress. It was his personal, shall we say, individual achievement to do this. Amazingly, what he created was something that could survive even beyond his own life. And that's something which is amazing, because what he created, shall we say, was a true legacy, something that wasn't dependent on him and his charisma, but was ultimately something that would be able to survive beyond him and create the foundations and the infrastructure that would lead to a Jewish state. Now, part of its success was his charisma. People said that he looked like, an Assyrian king. If you look at those stone images in the British Museum of kind of the Assyrians, Herzl with his beard very much kind of looked like that. And he was commanding, and he was able to ultimately bring different Jewish groups that didn't, see, completely eye to eye on things together in this Congress, and ultimately created something that outlived him. Incredibly, at Basel, at that first Zionist Congress, Herzl had written the following in his personal diary. If I had to sum up the Basel Congress in one word, which I shall not do openly, it would be this: at Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I were to say this today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50, everyone will see it. And so it was 50 years later, the Jewish state was founded with the state of Israel. This visionary that was Herzl, he becomes known as the Chozeh HaMedina, the visionary of the state, ultimately was shown to be correct, that his ludicrous idea, something that really was far-fetched, the idea that Jews would succeed in self-determination despite thousands of years of persecution, and then despite the fact that great empires, were ruling over the world, that ultimately through organization, through unified international activity, the Jewish community could reassert its ancient rights of Jewish sovereignty, Jewish autonomy, and that ultimately leads not just to Jewish autonomy, but actually to a Jewish state. And so in our final lecture, we're going to look at that Jewish state, and we're going to see what it has become and to look at how it has attempted to answer the Jewish question, shall we say, for the final time, right? To provide a truly final solution to that Jewish question. So please be sure to join me for that lecture as well. But in conclusion, it's difficult to overstate the significance of Herzl, a person who really wouldn't have been the person that you would have expected this vision to come from, who set forth an idea, a roadmap, an organization that ultimately would be able to achieve something that would be world-changing, altering for the Jewish world, that would think of a radical solution to this Jewish question that had baffled and had troubled Jews and non-Jews already for well over a century by the time Herzl comes about. And for the first time, he puts forward a vision, well, not immediately, ultimately, shall we say, succeeds, because indeed he does create a Jewish state. If you'd like to learn more about Theodor Herzl, I'd suggest a recent work by Derek Penslar titled Theodor Herzl, the Charismatic Leader.